and welcome back. For the last month or so, I've done nothing but glaze pots and fire kilns. I've done 6 firings in total, which means about 900 pieces have gone through the kiln, all fired on these brand new silicon carbide kiln shelves, courtesy of the kiln and wheel manufacturers Rohde. So all my thanks go to them. They were incredibly helpful when I was setting up my studio, and I throw using their wheels and fire using their kilns. Anyhow, what makes these shelves so exciting, and I realise that's probably the nerdiest pottery thing I've ever said, is just how thin and light they are, which ultimately means I'll be able to squeeze more pots in each firing, thus making each firing more cost efficient. Not only that, the firings themselves become quicker, as there's less kiln furniture to heat up. They're also considerably lighter, like you can see here. This is one of my old shelves, which comes in at just over 7 kilos, and whilst that isn't so heavy, it can be tricky lifting them and positioning them at the very top of the kiln, where there's no space to manoeuvre. And here's the new shelf, coming in at just half the weight. But perhaps the most useful thing about these shelves is that they can withstand being fired to much hotter temperatures. My previous shelves, the thicker ones, would end up warping and sagging after a few firings, which meant I'd have to painstakingly grind off the kiln wash, flip them over, and paint the other side. Whereas with these, as they can withstand being fired to 1400 degrees Celsius, that's something I'll never have to do again. And as long as I keep these in good condition, they could last a good portion of my life. So, I ended up using these shelves for all 6 of my firings, the last of which I finished today actually, at the time of recording this audio. Anyway, that's probably enough about these shelves. This video will be about packing kilns, firing in reduction, and looking at some of the results, be it pots or glaze test tiles, which, if you've been following me over on Instagram, you may already have seen quite a few of those. As I knew I was going to do 5 or 6 consecutive firings, the first thing I do in preparation is create a ton of cone packs. These little coloured spikes, which are set in a clay-like material called wadding, are placed inside the kiln, alongside the pots, and opposite the spy holes in the door. That way I can look at them during the firing. They measure heat work, which is heat over time, as opposed to just straight up temperature. And as certain temperatures are reached, the cones begin to slowly bend and melt over, like you can see here. And it's by looking at these that you can indicate at what stage the firing is at. So I know that when cone 10 is flat, which is the cone on the right of the trio, it's time to end the firing. At this stage their colour just comes from food colouring, so you can more easily tell which one is which. There is also a little number imprinted onto the base of each one, but trust me, there's nothing more irritating than placing them in the incorrect order, as if they melt out of sequence. You can really get quite lost during your firing, especially when working with a kiln that's fired manually, like my Rohde gas kiln is. I begin by making a big slab of wadding, which is a material I mix up myself, from 50% china clay and 50% coarse alumina hydrate. I then add water to this mixture until it's the same consistency as clay. All I'm making here are the bases in which I'll push these cones into, the base that'll support them during the firing and prevent them from falling over or bending in the wrong direction. This wadding material dries out very quickly, and I fire it in the kiln without bisque firing it first, which is another reason why I preemptively make all of these, as I don't want to place them into the kiln and fire them when they're still wet, as doing so can cause the wadding to explode if the temperature rise is too quick, scattering hundreds of little pieces all around the kiln, into pots, into the burners. It's a nightmare, so I make all of my cone packs a couple of days before I do any firing. But the assembly is simple, really. Naturally the cones lean in one direction, so I place them starting with the lowest number, 8, which is the yellow cone, and then there's 9, which is the grey cone, and 10, which is the pink one. Once roughly pushed into the wadding, I squeeze the material around each cone so that each is firmly held in place. I double check to make sure they're aligned, and then I'll set them aside with the others to dry out a little bit before I neaten them up later on. They're quite fragile objects, so you do need to handle them carefully. Cone packs are one of those things in the pottery world that every single potter seems to prepare a little differently, so don't be surprised if you see numerous ways of creating these packs online or in books. The last thing I do is to cut away any excess wadding, as really, as long as they're stable, they don't need all of this material splaying out on either side, so I carefully cut the extra bits away, which can be amalgamated back with the rest of my wadding and used for different things, or more cone packs, and you'll see that really quite a lot is salvaged. In terms of storing this material, as it does dry out very quickly, I always give it a really good spray with water, and then I push some plastic wrap really tightly all around it in the bucket. Then I pop the lid on and store it away. Now it's time to pack the kiln, loading the pots onto these pristine new kiln shelves that are ever so thin. The cone pack may look like it's placed randomly, but in actuality it's opposite where the spy hole is in the kiln's door, and it's crucial to position it correctly, as I need to be able to see these during the firing. As for placing the pots in, the general rule is that none of them can touch each other, so in between each is about 2 to 3 millimeters. If they do touch, what happens is that during the firing, as the glaze melts, the pots simply fuse together, which isn't ideal. But there is a rule for packing this lowest shelf that doesn't apply to any of the other layers, which is followed to try and get as even a firing temperature-wise as possible, and you can kind of see it here. On the lowest level, I place taller pots on the left and right side, and as they get towards the centre, they get lower and lower, essentially creating a cavity into which the flames will be able to flow more easily. Here's an example of a pot that needs to be refired. There was a small pinhole which I plugged up with glaze, and it'll be placed alongside a few other refired pots right at the front on this lowest layer. Usually I save this spot along the front for refires only, as it never reaches optimum temperature, so instead I place pots there that just need a tiny bit more, or pieces that have had additional glaze applied to them to fix them, and all they need is for that additional glaze to be melted. This lowest layer though definitely takes the longest to pack, due to having to load the pots in such a way that they get lower towards the middle, which isn't such a worry on the layers above. I can pack those incredibly densely, all with the same forms, and the flames still manage to permeate them perfectly well. Another factor which I need to constantly think about is the glaze that comes off on my fingertips as I handle these powdery pieces. If I handle a pink pot and then a white one, there's a good chance I'll leave pink fingerprints on the white surface, so I constantly have to wipe my fingertips in between handling different coloured pots. I then double check the cones, just to make sure that they're really visible through the spy hole. I've fired kilns enough times with cones that are sort of difficult to see, so nowadays I make sure they're always in plain sight, with no pots obstructing the view. Once the layer underneath is complete, I carefully place the new silicon carbide shelves onto a set of 3 props, so that each shelf is held up like a tripod, which makes it very stable. I then figure out which props I'll need for the next layer in order to achieve the right height. So for instance, for these mugs, they just needed a little bit extra to clear it. But from here on after, unlike the bottom layer, I can pack the kiln far more tightly to really make it as cost efficient per firing as possible. And it's worth knowing that whilst I load the kiln, I do envision what the rest of the kiln pack will be like. I'm not just packing each layer at random. I know from previous firings and experience where the pots fire best, where to avoid placing certain forms in favour of others. But all that being said, I still do learn a huge amount with each firing, especially with all these new glaze test tiles which I've been firing alongside my pots, which means each time I unpack a kiln load of work, there's a wealth of new information to look at, and I'll show you some of those test tiles later on in this video, and I may even make a longer video about my tests. If that's something you might be interested in, let me know in the comments. I've been searching for a new range of surfaces, glazes that'll go alongside my usual greens and whites, and ones that'll also work on porcelain, as I'm really yearning to use it once again after so many years. I've been trying to figure out how much extra space these new kiln shelves will provide me with in each firing, and after 6 firings over the past 2 or 3 weeks, it looks like it provides me with an extra shelf and a half worth of work per firing, which is huge. Anything that lets me process my work more quickly is a benefit, which is also another reason why I've been looking into alternative glazes, ones with higher clay content, which makes their application easier and therefore faster too. This will be the 7th gas kiln I've used in my lifetime, albeit the first one I've actually owned, and each one has had to be packed in slightly different ways and also fired in slightly different ways. It always takes some time to learn how each one has to be used, which means when it's your first time firing one, you sort of have to jump in the deep end, if there's no one there to guide you through it. When I bought this kiln, I asked numerous potters who have the same model for their advice. I asked about their firing schedules, how they load the shelves, and things like that. And yet, my first firing was pretty awful. I underfired it, and I didn't reduce the kiln enough. And really, it took 3 or 4 firings to really nail down a firing schedule that worked for my clay and glazes, as ultimately, this varies quite a lot from potter to potter, especially as most of the potters I asked were firing their kilns using propane, whereas I use natural gas from the main supply, which changes a lot, but I'll speak more about that later on. The top shelf is where I usually fire larger pots, including my ink dip pens, which are slotted over thick nichrome rods and balanced upright before carefully being placed inside the kiln. Very occasionally, one of these pens will slump during the firing and stick either to the one next to it or an unsuspecting pot, which is a pain, but I think I've more or less resolved that issue, and I'll discuss that in much greater detail in a video that's all about making these ink dip pens from start to finish. The joy of packing these top layers is the fact that there's no props that you need to pack around. They also generally get the nicest finish in terms of glaze, as it's the area that gets the hottest, which is one of the reasons I reserve it for the larger vessels. And once the 3 cones on the top have been loaded, I can check them again through the spy hole to make sure that I can see them clearly. Generally, the cones on the top are much more difficult to see during the firing. I think this is because the flames at the top are far more turbulent than how they are at the bottom. There is a knack at looking at cones during the firing, and again, that's something I'll discuss later on in this video, when it's actually time to fire the kiln. The layers of bowls are always the most difficult to pack, I think. Trying to find the optimal layout, which is the most efficient and fits the most pieces in, can be tricky. Sometimes I'll try numerous iterations before I find the one that works best. And as the layers get closer towards the top of the kiln, positioning these shelves gets more and more difficult, but thankfully, as these shelves are much lighter than my previous ones, it isn't quite so bad. One thing that helps keep these layers nice and dense are the new espresso cups I've been making. They fit very snugly into all those little spots before that would have previously been empty, which is why it's always a good idea to have a kiln filler of some kind. It only takes an hour or 2 to pack the kiln, longer of course because I'm filming the process, but nonetheless it is a process I thoroughly enjoy. It's like a giant 3-dimensional puzzle, although one where you have to be very careful, as the surfaces of these pots are incredibly fragile, and mistakes like that do happen. The powdery coating of glaze that surrounds each pot, apart from the base, is soft, relatively. If you tap it or knock it, it will chip off. So that jar, for instance, I had to take it out, repair the area that was damaged, and carefully position it back in. It's quite an unbelievable change, really, that the pots undergo during the firing, changing from fragile, powder-clad objects to those that are as hard as stone and are covered in glass. For all the pots you see being loaded into the kiln, fundamentally, the glaze is the same base. The only thing that differs between them are single percentages of red iron oxide. The pink glaze contains just 1%, and the darker pink is 2%, and once exposed to a reduction atmosphere inside the kiln, this small percentage of iron will cause the glazes to turn green, whereas if they were fired in an oxidized atmosphere like you find in an electric kiln, these same pink glazes would fire to a sort of mottled yellow, which isn't particularly nice. So here's how the kiln looks before it's been fired, which is something I always do the following morning, as the entire process takes about 9 hours from start to finish. I check the cones through the spy holes one last time, and then before I go home for the day, I do a quick cleanup of all the pots that I didn't manage to fit inside the kiln, which there was a lot of in this case. Early the following morning, at 7 AM, I light the kiln. The gas is switched on at the wall, and then each of the 4 burners is ignited and kept on the lowest possible setting. I keep it like this for a few hours, so that any moisture that might still be in the pots or in the kiln is removed. And quite importantly, I'm lighting the kiln with the door open, which is a step that was drilled into me as a student, as if you light the kiln with the door closed, there is a chance it can quite literally blow up if something goes wrong. And I have in the past had to repair a kiln that had blown up. The force of the explosion bulged out the brick walls and really caused quite a lot of damage, enough so that the entire brick kiln had to be rebuilt. Once all 4 burners are fully lit, I close the door and tightly seal it. I also place the 2 bungs into the spy holes, and I also make sure that the damper, which covers the flues of the kiln, which lead up to the chimney, is mostly open. Thereafter, over about a 4.5 hour period, I slowly increase the gas pressure so that the temperature climbs higher and higher. At exactly 860 degrees Celsius, I set the kiln into a reduction atmosphere. I do this by increasing the gas pressure to 10 mbar and the compressed air to 0.4 bar. And perhaps most importantly, I slide the damper so it's about halfway closed. This causes the gas inside to burn inefficiently, as the exhaust can't exit the throttled kiln quickly enough, which means that there simply isn't enough air inside for the fuel, in this case natural gas, to burn properly, and as a result, the burning atmosphere inside the kiln begins to find oxygen from inside the clay and glazes of the pots, stripping away an oxygen molecule from an iron molecule, which bubbles out and brings iron with it, hence why the pots change to a green hue, and why the pots are covered in a scattering of iron specks. It's through these spy holes which I can see the cones, but I'm opening them for another reason. Ideally, I want to see a flame shooting out of them, as that's usually a good sign that the kiln's in reduction. I usually set this atmosphere at about the halfway point of the firing, and it'll last right until the end. These are my notes. Every half hour, I note down the temperature, the gas, the air pressure, and the position of the dampers, together with anything else that might be happening. Keeping detailed notes is crucial, as it means I can easily replicate firings and potentially see the cause if something were to go wrong. As the temperature slowly rises at about 60 degrees an hour, I periodically open the damper just a few millimeters at a time, so that the fuel can exit more quickly, which allows the temperature to rise, as otherwise it could very easily just stall. As the firing progresses, the colour of the flame becomes more and more vivid, changing from red to orange to yellow and finally white. And as the firing reaches its climax, as it approaches 1290 degrees Celsius, I'll begin to check the cones through these spy holes, which I blow into, which momentarily cools the spot where the cones are and makes their edges more visible. The cones begin to bend at about 1220 degrees Celsius, and every time I check them, I jot down the time and the position of the cones. Generally the top goes over first, but the bottom always catches up quite quickly. Here you can see how the gas is increased slowly. Excuse my poor handwriting. 10 is where reduction is initiated. As I'm using mains gas too, I also have to have an air compressor to help give the burners and flames enough pressure. It follows the gas, slowly rising. And lastly there's the damper. 30 would be the most open it can be, and 15 is halfway closed. Thereafter it's steadily opened until about 18 or 19, and that's usually when the firing ends. But as you can see, pretty much each firing is the same these days, with reduction occurring at the same point and in reality, the kiln is very easy to fire. All this might make it look complicated, but for most of the day, I'm doing something else in the studio, and simply every half hour, I check the kiln. Then, when my cones are all bent over to the right position, I can turn off the gas, the burners, and the air compressor. Silence. After a long day firing, I then fully open the dampers and the spy holes too, to allow the kiln to crash cool back down to 1000 degrees Celsius. This helps to ensure that the colours retain a certain vibrancy, and means the pots will keep a certain sheen too. If cooled slowly, the colours can dull down somewhat. This process only takes about 30 minutes or so, and throughout this time I'm careful not to walk directly in front of the spy holes, as the heat that comes out is still enough to set fire to clothes and melt plastic. Then, once the pyrometer reads exactly 1000 degrees, I slide close the dampers fully and place the 2 bungs back into the spy hole. From this point on, it'll take about 36 hours to fully cool down, and even then, I usually crack open the door when the kiln is at about 150 degrees Celsius. This kiln load actually cooled down over a long weekend, so you won't hear the cacophony the kiln usually makes, the pinging and the tinkling as the glazes contract over the clay body underneath. Opening any kiln load of work is always quite an anxious moment, as throughout this entire process, you really have no idea what's happening to the pots. You've only seen the information from the pyrometer and the cones through the spy holes, and I always have nightmares about things going wrong when I'm waiting to open a new kiln load of work. The difference in surface and colour is stark, but so far, so good. I have to unpack everything before I can really tell how the firing went. But just off the bat, there were some interesting glaze tests. In total, over the past 6 firings, I fired about 200 test tiles, such as this blue variant of my crackle glaze, coloured with a tiny bit of rutile and titanium dioxide and coated on very thinly. Here's the same glaze, but on porcelain. I like the vibrant white edges where the glaze breaks over the corners, but I'm still not sure it's the blue I'm looking for, or if it matches the palette of colours that I really like. I've also been on the search for a yellow, for both stoneware and porcelain, something to act as a nice counter to the green hues, but it's been remarkably challenging to find something I like, and something that's as vibrant as I imagine. Here's the same glaze, but on a stoneware test tile, and you can see how it's just more of a brown as compared to anything else. And this is just coloured from 1% red iron oxide and 1% titanium dioxide. And here's another yellow, which was meant to be more matte, but it's still just a bit too brown. Although the glaze on the porcelain feels lovely, it's incredibly smooth. And then for those wondering, these are what my crackle glazes look like, but on porcelain. On the right is the white, and on the left is 1% red iron oxide. They're nice, but I think they need to be applied slightly more thinly. And I had a few white bases which I was playing around with. These initial ones were okay, but there are some pinholing issues I need to figure out. Otherwise, the rest of the pots from the kiln were really good. Good colour, a very even firing temperature-wise, although there's always 1 or 2 undefied pieces from this bottom part of the kiln. And this is what that looks like. So here's an undefied section, and as you can see it's quite matte, as compared to the opposite side of the piece, which is quite glassy. This piece makes the grade for a pot that I would refire a second time. Otherwise, these kilns are quick to unpack. I generally start at the bottom and work my way upwards, although there's no real reason for any of this. I have had a few pots crawl, which is what you can see here, when the glaze separates from itself, leaving patches of the clay underneath, which is a fault of my own for glazing them too thickly. I place all the fired pieces out onto the table and spend some time looking over each pot and sanding the bases of every single piece. There were some good results, such as these cups, all different, something I still need to make a video about, as I did film the throwing and trimming of them, and the pulling of the delicate handles too. And here are some macro photos I took of some of the glaze test tiles up close. I won't be using everything I tested, but it is absolutely fascinating to see them this close up. Each is like its own little world, and once I have found a handful I'm happy with, I'll progress on to testing them on actual pots themselves, although that won't happen until the winter, as that's when I'll next be doing some firings. This Temuku is especially nice, made from the classic 25-25-25-25 recipe with 10% red iron oxide and 1% cobalt carbonate, and this vivid blue, which is my usual crackle, but with some cobalt in, which again I think is a bit too vibrant for my personal taste. Anyhow, I have 4 boards like this now, each full with the test tile both in stoneware and porcelain, covered in dozens and dozens of different glazes. After I've done my next shop update, which is actually going live tonight at 7 PM BST on the 19th of September, I'll spend a week or so analysing the glazes and deciding which ones I want to use, before continuing my making again and seeing how these new surfaces can influence my work and change it, hopefully. It's always fun trying to find a new direction. The pen bodies should hopefully just come off easily. Occasionally, iron speckles can attach themselves to the metal rod inside and they can get a little bit stuck, but for the most part they just lift away easily. And the reason I'm taking these off first is because recently I've been unpacking and repacking the kiln on the same day, so this rig that holds the pens up is needed again straight away. As there were a few pots that crawled, some glaze did fall on these shelves, but it pops away really easily. I use this tungsten carbide tipped scraper to bash the molten drips off. It's a bit of a pain that this happened with my new shelves, but it's easy to fix. I then use this concrete scraper just to go over those areas, grinding it smooth and to make sure there are no tiny shards of glaze that could be left. I then scrape away the worst of the dust and shards of glass, then vacuum away as much of the dust as I can. I then paint over these areas with backwash, which again is just 50% shiny clay and 50% coarse alumina hydrate, which I mix to a glaze-like consistency. Once the areas are patched, I quickly blast them with a heat gun, and then grind that area back smooth using the concrete scraper. And finally, once again hoover off the worst of the dust. And that's it for the shelves. I can't wait to keep firing with them. Thanks so much for watching, if you've made it this far, and I'll see you next week.